boys and girls. I'm Miss Tonya, and today we're going to talk some more about Jesus. If you got to watch the last video, you know we talked about that Jesus and his followers were coming to Jerusalem and they were going to celebrate the Passover, which was a big holiday for God's people that they celebrated every year to remember how God rescued them from Egypt when they were slaves. And you'll remember that all the people were lining the roadway and cheering and waving their palm leaves like a big parade, welcoming Jesus into Jerusalem because they were very excited to see him there. Now, after Jesus got to Jerusalem, he spent some time teaching in the temple. That was like the big church building that was in Jerusalem where they worshiped God. And Jesus would go there each day and he would teach and tell more stories and teach them how God loved them and how to be good followers. And then at night, he would actually go and sleep outside at the Mount of Olives, is what the Bible tells us. So it was like camping every night for them, I guess. Well, they had been there a couple of days, and Jesus wanted to have a special meal with his disciples. So he sent Peter and John, who were two of his disciples, to get the room ready for them to eat. And they said, well, where do we need to go to do that? Jesus said, when you go into the city, you'll see a man carrying water, and you follow him. And the house that he goes to, you speak to the owner and tell them that the master is ready to have the room, and he will show you the room that will be all ready, and you can make our preparations there. So that's what Peter and John did, and sure enough, there was a man carrying water, and they followed him, and they found the house that Jesus was talking about. Isn't it amazing how Jesus knew all those things? So they got ready, had everything ready, and Jesus and his disciples came to the room, and they were going to have a special meal together. Now, during Passover, the people that were the Jews, which were God's people, would eat certain things. They had special foods that they would eat during Passover, and one of the things they would eat was called unleavened bread. It didn't look like our bread, didn't look like what we would make sandwiches out of. It was flat, like a cracker, which is because it reminded them that when they were saved from Egypt, that they had to hurry and get out quickly, and they didn't have time for their bread to rise and be thick and fluffy. So every year at Passover, they would eat unleavened bread, which kind of looks like a big cracker. It might be round and look more like a tortilla, and that's what they would have. So Jesus that night, they were eating, and he took the bread and he broke it. And he passed it to his disciples, and he said, take this and eat it. This is my body, which will be sacrificed for you. Well, that sounds a little bit strange, but he was doing this for a very important reason. And so they did. They all ate some of it. And then he took the drink. It would have probably been wine back then, but we usually use grape juice now. But it would have come from grapes, and he took it and he said, drink some of this. This will be like my blood of the new covenant that will be poured out for you. And so they did. That probably seemed a little strange to them then, but later they realized what he was really talking about. And does this make you think of something that we still do now? That's right. On Sundays, we take the bread, or it's almost like a cracker, and we take the juice and we participate in this ceremony that Jesus put in place a long time ago. Some of you may have been making your own unleavened bread at home while we've been not being able to go to the church building. And that's where that came from. And every week when we do that, we do exactly what Jesus told the disciples to do. He said, when you do this, remember me. And that's what we do every week, to remember Jesus. It's a really cool thing that he put in place for us. Now, while they were eating, something really interesting happened. the disciples got into a little bit of an argument. They were talking about who was the most important. Now, we know who the most important person in that room was, right? It was Jesus. It wasn't any of the disciples, but they were kind of arguing about that, and Jesus heard them. But instead of getting on to them and scolding them for arguing, he did something that they probably never, ever forgot, to show them just who was the most important and what that person needed to do. Remember, we talked about that when people in that day went from place to place, they didn't have cars to ride in. And most of them didn't ride on donkeys like Jesus did coming into town. They walked. They walked pretty much everywhere they went. And the shoes they wore were like sandals, almost like flip-flops. And the roads were made out of dirt. So what happens when you walk on a dirt road with sandals on your feet? That's right, your feet get really dirty. So when people would go to someone's house to eat, like to have dinner at your friend's house, what would happen is they would usually have a servant that would come around and would wash everybody's feet, because it just makes you feel better if your feet are clean. So that was something that a servant usually did, not an important person. But Jesus, when his disciples were fussing about who was the most important, he got up and he took a towel and he wrapped it around him, and he got a basin with water, and he started going from one disciple to the next, and guess what he did? That's right, he was washing their feet. I'll bet you that room was so quiet that you could have heard a pin drop, because they did not expect Jesus, who was their teacher and their leader, to be acting like a servant and washing their feet. Now he got to Peter, and we all know about Peter. Peter usually sometimes would open his mouth and say things without always thinking about them first. But Peter said, "Oh, Jesus, you can't wash my feet. I can't let you wash my feet." And Jesus looked at him and said, "Unless you let me wash your feet, you cannot be a part of me." And so then Peter said, "Well, don't just wash my feet, wash all of me." And Jesus said, "You don't need all of you to be washed, because you're clean, just your feet." And so Jesus finished. He went all the way around and he washed all of their feet. And then he said, "Now, you have seen me serve you. You've seen me be a servant. That's what I want you to be to each other." And that's what Jesus wants us to be to people. He wants us to be a servant. He doesn't want us to think, "Oh, I'm the most important person." No. He wants us to serve other people. Such a good, important lesson that he taught to his disciples that night. Now, I've got a picture in my big book that shows you the disciples sitting around the table, and it probably was a really low table. The Bible actually said they reclined around the table, so they kind of leaned against each other. They didn't have tables like we have today. But they were eating their meal, and you can see Jesus back here where he's breaking the bread and he's passing it to his disciples. Well, when they finished their meal, Jesus had something he really wanted to do. Because Jesus knew that over the next couple of days, he was going to have some hard things that he was going to have to do. And so he wanted to do something to make himself stronger. And you know what that was? That's right, he wanted to talk to God. He would do that a lot of times and go away to a quiet place by himself and talk to God. Because remember, he knew God. He lived with God in heaven before he ever came to the earth. So he knew that talking to God was important, and it would make him stronger and make him feel better. So that's what he did. He and the disciples went out to the Mount of Olives, which is where the Bible tells us they had been sleeping. So that was kind of like where they had been camping out. But he went to a quiet place. It was called the Garden of Gethsemane. That's kind of hard to say. but the Garden of Gethsemane. And he took his disciples to the edge and he said, wait here and watch while I go and pray. And then he took John and Peter and James a little bit further into the garden with him, and he told them to stay here and watch while I go across that way and pray. And so they did. And Jesus went and he talked to God. And the Bible tells us he prayed very, very hard because he had so much on his heart. He was so concerned about what was about to happen. He knew he was going to need God to help him. And he prayed for a very long time. And then he went back to see about the disciples, and guess what they had done? Well, probably what you and I would have done. It was late, and it was dark, and they were sleepy. So they had fallen asleep. Jesus waked them up and said, can't you please stay awake and watch while I go and pray? And he went back and prayed again. He did that 3 times, and every time those disciples were falling asleep. Don't you know that Jesus really needed to talk to God? And the cool thing is, when we need to be strong and we know we're going to have hard things to happen, we can talk to God just like that, because God listens every time we talk to him. In fact, we can all be talking to him at the same time, and he can hear each one of us and listens and will help us when we need his help. Now, next time, Miss Tina is going to talk to you about what happened next in the garden. And it's an exciting story, so you don't want to miss it. So stay tuned, and Miss Tina will be on the next video to tell you about that. If you already watched the first video, you probably already know that there's some cool worksheets that you can download on your computer. In fact, I saw some of them, pictures of you guys doing some of them on Facebook. But some of those pictures actually are talking about what we talked about today, about the Last Supper, which is what we call that special meal that Jesus had with his disciples, about Jesus washing their feet, and about Jesus praying in the garden. And there's some coloring pictures right there. You can see those disciples had fallen asleep, but Jesus was still praying. So if you didn't get a chance to do these already, you can find them on the internet. If you go to PVCC.org, click on the little circle that says PVKids, and then click on the link that says Family Resources. And you can download these activities and these coloring pages and sheets and have fun doing those. So just remember, next time Miss Tina's going to be with you to talk about what happened next, and stay tuned. See you later.